I'm Amal Rajan. I'm the editor of The Independent, and you're watching London Live, where we've just had Election Smackdown, the big debate. We've had a fantastic panel here tonight, pretty heated discussion with George Galloway, Maajid Nawaz, Janet Street Porter, David Lammy, and Ivan Massow. It's 7 weeks from an election, huge issues to talk about. We've had a panel discussion and an audience discussion about the big issues facing London today. Let's take a question from Tom Billings. Are you here, Tom?
Who can fix the housing crisis, and can it be done?
Who can fix the housing crisis, and can it be done? David Lammy.
The housing crisis is deep, and my sense is that actually, at the moment, we're heading for a bigger crisis. We built in London 40 council houses last year, and we lost thousands through right to buy. At the moment, Boris Johnson has changed the goalposts on what is affordable. He says that affordable is 80% of market value. That's 470,000 for a house in London, and the average wage is 36,000. So if you do the maths, the system is seriously broken, and we're not meeting the targets. We need a huge house building program. My party has, and Ed Miliband is committed to building 1 million homes over this next period. And certainly challenging developers not to just sit on land, but actually bring it forward and use it. I want, though, to move my party further. I think that we've got to review the green belt. We cannot have a situation where we're selling off playing fields in inner London and basically saving car parks in outer London. And if you're serious about housing for a new generation, you've got to build on the green belt. We absolutely have to cap rents. I called for this first in my party, and I'm pleased that it's now party policy. You cannot have a situation in which rents are rising by 20% in my borough, 40%, for example, in Richmond. Absolutely unacceptable, so you've got to cap rents. It's not socialist to do that. Angela Merkel ran on that in the last German election. Mike Bloomberg ran on that in New York. Neither of those two are socialists. So we have to review the green belt, and we absolutely have to get serious about building social housing, council houses, so people can move in. And in Tottenham, which has got the biggest homelessness problem in the country, then actually what you see are families in overcrowded accommodation, moving every 6 months, disrupting kids' schools, but also breaking up relationships. We have a crisis. I think it's #1 priority here in this city.
Janet Street Porter.
Well, as someone who was born in inner London and still lives in inner London, and who's walked right around the M25 or walked every which way in London, the one thing I profoundly disagree with is building on the green belt. It's a disgusting Philistine concept, I'm sorry. Go on a train from Fenchurch Street Station, head towards the Dartford crossing, and you see acre after acre of low-level industrial building that could be done better, built differently, and there's ample space on brownfield sites for housing. Ample. Plus, the housing crisis isn't all about London. If you go around Britain, you go into places like Margate, for instance, where high streets are full of empty shops, and that's replicated all over Britain. What we need to do is rezone these buildings and turn them into housing, and stop thinking about housing as something for family units. What we desperately need is to put older people and single people and essential workers right in the centre of towns and cities around the country. And they don't want to be stuck out in the bloody suburbs with a half-an-hour drive in if anyone will give them a lift. So I want to put housing back in the centre of towns. I want to change the high street because it's never going to live again. The shops that closed are never going to reopen because retail's changed and gone online. And yes, I want to build houses, but I don't want to build little boxes out in fields, because you can never undo that.
Okay, I'm going to ask Maajid to come in next. If you've got a point you want to make or a question, just please raise your hand now, and I'll try and make a note of it. Maajid Nawaz.
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest political betrayals of our generation, and the reason why I call it a political betrayal is because the people that are really suffering as a result of this London-based, and I agree with Janet, particularly acutely a London problem with housing, are the young, are those people who cannot afford a house, let alone the deposit for the house, living in this great city, one of the best cities in the world to live in. I am one of those people. I like to consider myself young, but I certainly consider myself somebody who's unable to afford, even as a parliamentary candidate, you'd think, someone relatively in a successful position at this current stage in life, if I lose after May the 7th, perhaps less successful. But I will say that I can't afford to buy a house in a city in which I'm attempting to represent. That tells us we're in the midst of a serious crisis, but that crisis will focus on the young. We have betrayed this generation, and there needs to be some political and constitutional reforms that engage the young more so in the political system so that their voice is heard. The reason they were betrayed, they have been betrayed, is because politicians aren't listening to the voices of the young. And unfortunately, part of that problem is because young people vote less than everyone else. Now, I'm going to give everyone on this panel, by the way, is going to tell you they want to build more homes. I can say the same thing. Lib Dem policies to build 300,000 new homes. Everyone's going to say that. So I'm not going to make these promises. What I'm going to say is the following. Why don't we appoint a minister, a housing minister in cabinet who will be accountable, whichever government, whichever combination of government comes in after May, probably going to be a coalition, but whichever one it is, if there's a housing minister who's accountable to that government and therefore to the electorate to get us out of this fix that we're in, to get us unstuck so that people, young people, can afford to live again, I think that will help to solve the problem.
On the whole housing crisis, I mean, this is the only thing this is one of the big things I'm talking about all the time. And the feedback I'm getting is that you have to be either very rich or very poor to live in London. There's nothing in the middle. And we hear about social housing and the sort of issues you're talking about an awful lot. I'm more concerned, and I think it's been reflected on the panel, about people who just simply can't afford to live here on standard incomes. I kind of wanted to pick up on the green belt and something that Janet said as well, because I'm kind of with Janet on this. I just don't think we should be building on the green belt at all. There's a lot of land in London that can still be developed. There's the NHS, for example, has 3.5 times the size of Hyde Park in estates that could be probably more cleverly used, and there's hectare upon hectare of these kind of brownfield sites. But also, I'd like to look at planning laws generally. I think that London could go up a floor. There's a sort of crisis on now, and families are being forced from, let's say, Hackney to move out to the outskirts if they have another child because they can't fit in their homes. And if they could more easily, if there was a presumption of no to a presumption of yes in planning, that you would get permission to move things forward, that you can make this application which is tremendously expensive and so time-consuming to do, and then we know that on the whole we're just going to come up against a brick wall. So I would like to see a real change in the way that public land's used. I'd like to see a real change in the way that planning's organised in this country, and especially in London. And I think the mayor needs more control over that.
Okay, thank you. George Galloway.
Well, I agree with David, which no one will say when the prime ministerial debates eventually take place. And I didn't think there was anything disgusting or Philistine in what he said. Indeed, I agreed with every single word of it. Maajid said that we're all going to
He's trying to sabotage my chances.
in fact, I fully endorse.
I fully endorse David.
That really is sabotaging his chances.
Maajid said that we'd all say we want to build more houses. Of course, a Liberal Democrat and a Conservative can say it with the least conviction because they're actually in power, although you won't hear that much said now by Liberal Democrats. But the Million Homes pledge of Ed Miliband is one of the better promises that he has made. As it happens, and I don't know why you weren't there as a mayoral candidate, I was discussing this very issue in a debate in Parliament last night on the subject of the crown jewels or the family silver sell-off that TfL want to embark upon, and asked the House last night to give them permission to do so. 3 MPs, one Mr. Slaughter from Hammersmith had to go, but he did a good job before he did, 3 MPs, John MacDonald, Jeremy Corbyn and me, scuppered that bill. It's not often you achieve anything in Parliament. We did last night. We stopped it. And one of the reasons why I got involved in it was the Earl's Court development, where not only did we lose one of our finest exhibition and concert centres, not only did we lose hundreds of highly skilled transport for London jobs, real jobs where people make things and fix things and make things work that have stopped working, but we lost 738 affordable houses just there at Earl's Court. And in the context of what David said, that last year in London, only 40 council houses were built, and the definition of affordable houses in the private rented sector is frankly absurd for most people. You get a measure of how serious this crisis is. I only want to add one thing, because I've spoken long, I know. You're getting anxious.
Not at all.
And
if you've got something you'd like to come back on, raise your hand.
You'll be more anxious when you know what it is.
God, I hope it's not about me, George.
No, but foreign owners of property in London are a major part of the problem. People are buying in London purely as a nest egg for their money. Many of them never cross the threshold of the houses that they are buying. And that's a monstrosity. And somebody, the mayor, the new government, is going to have to get to grips with that. We have to tax and tax and tax again until that problem begins to dissipate.
But George, hang on a minute. The problem isn't just rich Russians, whatever. The problem in London with no affordable housing isn't people from all around the world buying off plan, you know, as investments. It's people of my generation buying for buy-to-let flats. Because the minute they've got their nest eggs, the minute they've got their money now, the minute they've got access to their pensions, they're all buying buy-to-let flats, and, you know, they own 2 or 3.
Well, that's why we need a rent cap. There's not, I mean,
yeah, but
actually, we need
what you
more.
want to do is stop pensioners buying flats as an investment, because they are doing it. They're all
The
doing it.
738 affordable homes on the Earl's Court site are being replaced by apartments so lavish that even a member of Parliament couldn't afford to live in one.
As an assistant head teacher in a central London school, extremism is something that I'm particularly worried about in light of recent events. I wondered how the panel thought we can most successfully address extremism in young people in the UK.
Maajid Nawaz.
There's a tendency of the extreme left and the extreme right on this debate to do one of 2 things. One, on the far left, is to pretend there's no problem and to actually blame everything on foreign policy, to blame everything on invasion of countries, on the creation of Guantanamo Bay. And rightly so, these are real grievances, and these are things we should rightly be objecting to, all of them. And then on the right, on the far right especially, there's a tendency just to blame all Muslims. And I think actually too many people have either been, because they wanted to avoid the polarization of that debate, too many people in the middle have been trying to be part of polite society and not really get involved. I mean, there's one thing people say never discuss over a dinner table, and that's religion and politics, unfortunately, so I have to do every day for my job. And, we've got to start having these conversations. We've got to start addressing extremism in civil society. But the solution to this problem, whether it's extremism in schools, whether it's extremism in universities, let's not forget, it's not just Muhammad Amwazi and the so-called jihadi John who went to the University of Westminster. I myself, when I was with ut-Tahrir, an Islamist organization, was also president of the student union. It's something that's been going on for decades in London, unchecked. And I think I follow the kind of anti-racism model, the anti-homophobia model, the anti-anti-Semitism model, which is basically civil society. We need to start challenging this extremism where we see it, not being afraid of being called racist when somebody is a theocratic fascist. The problem is that they're a theocratic fascist. That's the problem, and they need to be challenged. And we've got to make this form of extremism as unattractive and as unappealing as, let's say, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, or Hugo Chavez are to most people.
Okay, thanks very much. George Galloway, and then we're going to take a gentleman at the back. If we can get a mic to the gentleman at the back, please. George Galloway.
Well, it takes one to know one, of course, and Maajid used to be a theocratic fascist. Hizb ut-Tahrir used to say that it was forbidden for Muslims to be involved in democracy. That was their whole shtick, that it was haram for Muslims to vote. Indeed, I know someone that Maajid denounced on the way into a polling station. So I'm not making this up. Now, he's seen the light, and I commend him for that. Democracy is not haram. It's the only way. However, I agreed actually with much of what Maajid said. I didn't expect to, but I did agree with it. I'm not one of these who denies there's a problem. Indeed, I have protection this very evening from theocratic fascists who are threatening to blow me up. So I don't deny it, I denounce it. The question is, what's the effective way of denouncing it? Now, the PREVENT strategy, of which Maajid and the Quilliam Foundation have been notable and massive inheritors of very large sums of public money, clearly has failed. The most senior Muslim police officer in London on the Today programme last week said so, that the PREVENT agenda has become a toxic one, and that organisations like the Quilliam Foundation have failed. That's what the most senior police officer in London said. He's a liar. He's a liar.
He's retired.
He's retired, yes. Or he wouldn't be speaking on the Today programme. I'm for ideological struggle against these Islamist fanatics, because what they are doing abroad in profusion, they will one day try to do here. And the people who've left here to go there and do that will, if they're not killed there, come back here and try to do it here one day.
Okay, thanks very much, George. Maajid, do you want to come back on a couple of those specific allegations?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's ever seen that South Park episode where they blame Canada, you know there's that song, Blame Canada. I mean, this is absurd to blame Quilliam, which is a civil society-based organization that attempts to do two things: safeguard our civil liberties in the so-called war on terror. Actually, I think you were a member of the party that spearheaded the war on terror, George. You were still with the Labour Party then, weren't you? So, you know, that whole decade when Guantanamo was set up, people were rendered to be tortured, countries were invaded. On the one hand, we've opposed all of that. You know, I opposed the Iraq war from a jail cell. So one of the ways in which to defeat the brand that ISIS pushes out there and the attractiveness, the appeal of the Islamist ideology, is to maintain the moral high ground. Indeed, it's the reason I eventually, after my release as a political prisoner, joined the Liberal Democrats, because they were the only political party that opposed the invasion of Iraq.
Okay, thanks very much. There's a gentleman right at the back. A succinct question, if you would, please, sir.
Sure will. Thanks, panel. In lieu of the fact that the government, and I applaud them on this, has sought to ratify Article 14 of the Human Rights Elimination of Discrimination Bill in lieu of gender discrimination and disability discrimination, does the panel think that they might have gone a little bit further, given that we are experiencing rising tides of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism, that they could also have included racism in that remit?
Okay, thanks very much indeed. And a question at the front here.
I just want to address something Maajid said. He very swiftly glossed over the excuse for foreign policy. The fact is, most of these terrorist acts, when they publish videos or audios, they cite that as their reason for these actions. The fact is that I think the government has never really addressed this issue. They've never really reviewed what happened at the Iraq War. You had the Shilkot inquiry, which I think hasn't been finished. When are they actually going to admit that they've made mistakes and some of the things they've done has actually led to terrorism?
Okay, thank you. Ivan Massow.
I was really interested in, I actually watched a video or a speech that Maajid did on the whole issue, and he talked about there needing to be a narrative, the fact that we've moved to a kind of age where it's no longer specifically about religion or colour or anything, and it's about a narrative, about a story, about the way you grow up. And it made me think about the way I grew up, and I grew up actually Church of England, and I even went to church every Sunday. I was an altar boy and rang the little bell and everything. And I was distanced from my community and especially my church by my sexuality. I found it very difficult to, of course, align myself with my church. I came to London, and the narrative in London was one still back in the 90s of being quite frosty, but as time has moved on, London has become incredibly inclusive. And the narrative, and London's narrative for me, is one of social inclusion, and it's become bigger. There's something about being in London, being a Londoner, which I think has completely changed for me now. When I was younger, you always heard about people identifying with New York. They were New Yorkers, but we didn't quite know. We didn't even know what it was to be British, but we certainly didn't know what it was to be a Londoner. It was all about pearly kings and queens out in the East End. But now it means something else, and it means something incredibly special. And I want this story to take over. I don't give a damn about religion. I care about our shared values. I care about the fact that David and I are both standing for a role. We're both looking for, and we both effectively sort of come from minority groups, but in that, we are the majority. We're part of the great majority of London, because London is this sort of hodgepodge of different types of people. And I think that's really exciting, and sending that message out and allowing kind of everyone to enjoy what I'm enjoying inside, why I love being here. I'm hoping it's contagious, and I'm hoping it'll affect the way people live and think.
Okay, thank you. Janet, Street Porter?
Well, to return to the question, we have been round the block, haven't we? We've settled a lot of scores.
The question from Johnny Clark was, how do you
Yeah.
think we can most successfully address extremism in young people in the UK?
Yeah. Well, let's think about the composition of the class that you have to deal with, because it has changed fundamentally in London since I went to primary school in Fulham. So you're probably teaching a class, the majority of the children are one faith, aren't they? Now, even when I went to school in Fulham, we didn't know any Catholics. We used to say, who are these Catholic people? What do they look like? Because London's faith schools were strictly segregated, and outside school you didn't mix with anyone. And it wasn't till I went to my next school, my secondary school, that I was in a more mixed environment. And I suppose the trick is to broaden children's horizons from the minute that they start primary school. And you can only broaden their horizons through culture. And I was reading in the paper, which party is it that wants to have cultural vouchers? What a brilliant idea, because you've got to expand children's horizons, not shrink them. And their default position, because children are quite fearful, will be to be with people who are familiar to them, and they won't want to do things which are new and challenging. But if you can encourage them to go out, to broaden their horizons, then you'll get them to see that there are alternative ways of thinking. By the time they've got to university, it's almost too late, because you go through your teenage years hardening. You're a rebel, and then you harden your stance. I mean, I'm speaking really personally, because I do think the problem in London is quite different to a lot of, the rest of the country. I think London's got a particular problem, but you've also got a particular way of solving it.
Can I just caution the way that we talk about this subject? I think we need a lot more light and less heat. There are 1.1 million Muslims in this country under the age of 30. There are about 0.05% of them that have attempted to get on a plane and go to Syria. And we have to keep into perspective the vast majority of Muslims in this country who are law-abiding, who want to go about their business and watch with horror what is happening in their name. That said, in 2005, between King's Cross and Russell Square, a very dear friend of mine that I went to school with was blown to smithereens in the 2005 bombings. He was blown up by a young Jamaican man, broadly speaking the same age as me then, who was a convert to Islam. In my job, I go all around the country, particularly to deprived communities all around the country. Frankly, there is something in common between a white young man growing up in a seaside town or in parts of even suburban London, seduced by an extreme EDL, or a young black man growing up in urban Britain, seduced by a gang culture, a knife crime, and indeed a young man growing up in parts of the Muslim community seduced by that extremism. The way you deal with that is the same old way you deal with young men that might be seduced by extremism. It is, and actually by older men that seek to exploit them for their own purposes, usually. It's about quality youth services, which very sadly across the country is being decimated. It's about role models, fathers, mothers, a broader sense of community around. At the moment, we've got parents working the longest hours in Europe, and there are real issues with absent parents in parts of our community that runs right across. It's about the old-fashioned bits of civic community, synagogues, mosques, churches. It's about how we fund those things and whether we value them. It's why, incidentally, I do not think we should be spending 120 billion on renewing Trident. We should attend to those things at home. And if we do that, we'll get less of this violence.
I was just wondering, we're talking about democracy. I was wondering, I don't have any particular position on this issue, but is a hereditary monarchy an impediment to true democracy in Britain?
Is a hereditary monarchy an impediment to true democracy in Britain? Janet Street Porter.
I personally am a Republican. I can't see what the monarchy brings to Britain other than to reinforce the notion that we're a theme park. So they are a very critical, they have a critical role to play in theme park Britain. Because without them in the middle of the theme park, tourists want to see them, to photograph them. We need all the pageantry, and the tourism industry is increasingly a valuable part of our economy. So they've got a role to play. How many of them and what they actually do? Well, I'd like very few, obviously. When I read in the papers today that Prince Harry is having a gap year at 30, I just laugh.
Thank you. Ivan Massow, is the monarchy an impediment to true democracy in Britain?
I don't think so. I think it actually helps democracy. I like the Queen, and I like the royal family generally. But what I like about the system that we have at the moment is, I think it's the honours system. The way that it kind of encourages and recognises the good that people do. Especially when I'm standing for this role and I'm interviewing people, I get people come into my office every day and they're telling me about things that need to improve or the way that London can change, or they're just really involved, whether it's just supplying wheelchairs for children, whatever they're doing, they're just completely committed, and none of them are going to be mayor at the end of it. I look at them, I just think that so many people do such amazing works and they put so much into the system. And I like the fact that we live in a society that sort of recognises that through this honour system and through this great kind of...
Have you got an honour?
No, I haven't.
Just
Not
checking
yet.
it.
Not yet.
So from that perspective, I like them. I do understand that. Well, I just think that we have a very, very honest democratic system, and I support the way it runs at the moment, and I don't really want to break it.
Okay, thanks very much. George Galloway.
Few will remember, as I do, on Janet's point about theme parkery, it's a royal knockout. And I had a vision when she was talking that we could actually have a permanent It's a Royal knockout and have the royal family there permanently, and it would probably be quite a tourist attraction. It's an absurdity, a hereditary monarchy, but it's quite a small one. I get worked up about a lot of problems in the country. This is a problem, but at the moment a small one, because we have a monarch who's pretty well universally highly regarded in the country. But I caution you now, and I caution them, they really would be better to miss out Charles and go to the next one down, because I promise you, if Charles becomes king, that Republican feeling in Britain will swiftly rise, because he actually interferes in democracy constantly, and we're not allowed to see the letters that he has written. We're not allowed to see the letters that ministers write back to him. Now that's a democratic monstrosity, and that's before he gets the gig. If he becomes the king, look out for the third chapter of House of Cards, the original House of Cards, To Kill the King, or whatever it was called.
Thank you. David Lammy.
I've got a small view that the monarchy could do with a little bit of diversity. So Harry needs to marry Rihanna and things will get a lot better.
Catholics in, never mind black people.
But let me just tell you a story about Charles. The toughest day of my political life was walking down Tottenham High Road the morning after the riots and comforting men and women standing just in their pajamas, holding their kids with their shops burnt to the ground and sometimes their homes. I got a number of phone calls in the course of that day. David Cameron phoned. Ed Miliband phoned. Nick Clegg phoned. And they all said, can we come? And they came. None of them have been back. Prince Charles also phoned. He came. He has been back 5 times, and he doesn't just come back for a visit. He's brought all his charities, business in the community, the Prince's Trust, his work on inner city and environment and architecture. He's doing some work currently around regeneration in Tottenham. He hasn't done it with fanfare. He hasn't put out press releases. He's just done it because he cares. So my experience up close of him personally is actually he's put more in to the community I represent than some of those who represent our parties.
Thanks very much. Maajid Nawaz.
I would suggest to you, David, if that's the case, he should stand for election in Tottenham and see if the people vote for him. I mean, frankly, look, you know, you've got a situation in this country where I'm an Essex boy born and raised. I moved to London at 16, and I've had to fight and struggle to get to where I am in life, and it involved a stint in prison, as you've heard in the middle. But I've had to really, really fight to get where I am and work hard. If we live in the sort of country where somebody whose birthright means he's born into wealth, he's born into privilege, he can afford to visit Tottenham because he's got no other job to do, and he can basically just lord it, you know, he walks into a room, everyone has to stand up. Just imagine what that does for the psychology of the nation when it comes to the class-based society we have. Imagine what it does to people from ethnic minority backgrounds who can never be king in this country at the moment. Imagine what it does for anyone actually genuinely from a minority. Imagine there was a homosexual king. I wonder how the Constitution would take that. So actually what it does in terms of the reinforcing the classist mindset is what I have a problem with, and then it's reinforced actually a bigger problem in the monarchy. You know, I wish he was actually head of tourism and was paid a salary annually, and actually we just had a tourism monarchy. Because then you look at the House of Lords, and it's reinforced there as well. We've got roughly 789 people stuffed into the House of Lords, largely because they donated to one of the main political parties.
Some of them Lib Dems, Maajid.
Including my own, I said it before you. Right, and they're on, you know, they cost the taxpayer £130,000 a year. So I'd say reform the House of Lords, get it elected. I mean, this is in this day and age, it's the mother of parliaments. We're meant to be a democracy. Have an elected House of Lords, have proportional representation, have voter age at 16 so the young have a voice, and for God's sake, move elections out of May because all these young people are busy studying for their exams and they can't get involved in elections.
Samuel.
Hi there. Should the poor physical state of the Houses of Parliament be taken as an opportunity to move the centre of political power to a northern city?
Should the House of Parliament be moved to a northern city? Ivan Massow.
Yeah, I've actually often thought that potentially the House of Commons could go to, let's say, Birmingham, especially when we've done the new rail link. And the reason I think that is that it's incredibly expensive to live in London, and everyone thinks that we get such an easy ride. During that great big kind of debate we had about Scotland, the yes-no thing, there was so much anger directed at London, where in fact the cost of living here is something like 40% higher. Our salaries aren't a great deal more, and we get so little more. We get much less spent on us per head. And I think if perhaps we moved Westminster to Birmingham, it would not only send out an amazing message to the rest of the country, and it would stop this animosity against London.
Thanks very much. David Lammy?
I just worry that this narrative that London, the streets of London are paved with gold. And this assumption, there are challenges, huge challenges in the north of England. But why don't we move the House of Commons to Tottenham? I mean, there are parts of this. No, it's not funny. It's not funny. Why not? We haven't got an agency. We haven't got a passport office. There are no civic. They're all on Whitehall. There are parts of this city. That's why we have these gang wars, where from one postcode to the next people might not move, that are a long, long way from Westminster. So can we just, when we talk about where to move the Commons, can we not just run into this narrative that all of the problems are in the north of England, all of the problems are in the seaside coast, and there aren't problems in our midst, in our city?
Maajid Nawaz.
I have a lot of sympathy for what David just said today. I was in East Ham today, and it feels a world away from where we're sitting right now. So I have a lot of sympathy for that. What I would say, actually, I think the capital of any nation should host its parliament. I think that, Washington, D.C. has Congress. I think let's move a few other things outside of the City of London. I'm glad that the BBC has started relocating some of its offices up north. But, the financial centre could consider moving. I mean, some of those bankers need to be paying the country back. I think they should go up north and live in some of those more challenged areas where the economic regeneration they claim to be giving the country could do with that, with their presence. So I'd say keep the political capital here, but the fusion, the fact that we have this peculiar situation in the United Kingdom, where our financial capital, our media capital, our political capital, and our film and movies and everything is all based in one city. If you look at the USA, you've got Hollywood on the West Coast, you've got Wall Street in New York, and you've got the Congress in Washington, D.C. That serves a nation well when you split it up like that, and I think that's the sort of lines along which, and that's future planning, it's what we need to be looking at. But I do have a lot of sympathy for the fact there are a lot of deprived areas in London that also need attention, and I'm not running for Mayor of London.
Can I ask Samuel Desborough the question of what he thinks is the answer? Shout. You might have to shout. Get a hold of a mic.
I think possibly we may be able to, this might be a really sort of far off idea, but maybe follow in the footsteps of Brazil and have a purpose-built capital city, like they move political power to Brasilia from Rio de Janeiro. And perhaps that would allow development to be pushed out of other major cities, maybe add some more housing, more infrastructure to maybe have a northern metropolis that has the same kind of clout as London does to draw in investment into this country.
Okay, Janet?
That's not too far-fetched, because Istanbul and Ankara, Turkey did that with Ankara, and Pakistan did that with Islamabad. Pakistan's capital used to be Karachi, which is still the financial capital, but they moved their political capital to a new-built city, which was built along the Washington, D.C. lines. And Turkey did the same thing. It's not a far-fetched idea.
And Egypt's about to do it with a new capital just east of Cairo. Janet?
I think that's a pretty smart idea, but our track record of building new cities is not good. And at the moment, I don't think there has been an attractive, large-scale development since the garden cities, like Welwyn Garden City and Letchworth in the 1920s, which were based on the principle that everybody could walk to work or walk to a transport hub within 20 minutes. And since then, we've built some really, really disastrous things like Thamesmead and so on. Now the government wants to build new garden cities. They want to build one at Ebbsfleet, which is actually quite an interesting site because it's got lots of very, very good transport links already. I kind of like the idea of taking a leaf from Wolf Hall and having a progress around the country. So just like Henry VIII in Wolf Hall went from posh house to posh house and basically leached off people who had to support him, I'd like to start by halving the number of MPs. We've got far too many MPs at the moment. So half as many, pay them twice as much. Then move them to Manchester, to Newcastle, wherever. Move them around the country. Like school terms. Why are they in Westminster? I don't see the point of it. And going back to the question about the royal family, we could bung the royals in the Houses of Parliament, bung them all in that building, and pull down Buckingham Palace, which is a third-rate building anyway.
George Galloway.
Well, we visited upon the original Australians, convicts. Maajid wants to visit on the north, bankers. I'm not sure that's very fair. There's nothing of a punishment living in the north, neither in the north of England, which of course for me as a Scotsman is the south. We must though grasp this nettle, because the bill for the renovation of the present parliamentary building is £3 billion and rising. And I don't think that any parliament is going to be able to get such an expenditure past the media and past the public opinion. So we are very soon going to have to grasp this nettle. And there is no reason for Parliament to be in London. London will do fine without 650 members of Parliament running around. But it would make a huge difference to the north. And so I have argued for many years that we should move the Parliament to Leeds, somewhere on the outskirts of Leeds. Manchester already has the BBC, doesn't need also to get the Parliament. Leeds is more or less the centre of the country, not Birmingham. Birmingham may be around the centre of England, but of course is not the centre of the country. So Leeds would be, I think, the optimal place. And we could purpose build a tower block for members of Parliament to live in at a stroke, ruling out these second home allowances and the John Lewis list and all the other scandals that we've seen over recent years. It would be a bit of a security risk, them all being in the one building, but that perhaps is a double-edged point to make. So I strongly believe in it. I agree we need a thorough overhaul of our democracy, proportional representation. Janet's right. I wrote in a book more than a decade ago, we need half as many MPs as we've currently got. And if we did, then the hue and cry about their wages would not be so great, and so on. There are many, many reforms. And the best time to make reforms is when you're starting afresh in a new place with a new Parliament building. And we could make the Palace of Westminster a simply wonderful museum, because it's a very beautiful building. It's just not very effective as a workplace, nor is it value for money as a workplace.
Okay, I'm so sorry, guys. I can see lots of you want to get in, but we've got to leave it there because our time is up. It's worth saying that part of the reason we have to finish so promptly is because several members of our panel have other engagements, which shows you... will they get paid? Did the panel get paid? No, of course not. This is The Independent, for goodness sake. Dear me. But I'd like you all to say thank you very much indeed to Ivan Massow, David Lammy, George Galloway, Janet Street-Porter, and Maajid Nawaz. Brilliant. Those were the highlights of Election Smackdown, the big debate with me, Amol Rajan, the editor of The Independent. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.